This is One on One. You're looking at Amy Ellis Nutt, who is the author of Shadows Bright as Glass, the remarkable story of one man's journey from brain trauma to artistic triumph. Good to see you, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Incredible story. Won the 2011 Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Story about, this is a book about John Sarkin.
Yes.
Talk to us about it.
John Sarkin, originally from New Jersey, Hillside, New Jersey. In his early 30s, lived up in on the North Shore of Boston, married for 2 years, had a young son, a chiropractor, basically successful, 9 to 5, button-down kind of guy. And one day he's out on the golf course and he leans down to get the tee out of his bag and something happens in his head. He describes it like a freight train ran through his head, painlessly, but he knew something catastrophic had happened. Within days, he started to experience tremendous tinnitus, the ringing in the ears,
Right.
but so loud that he compared it to 1,000 screaming baboons. He also, every sound became magnified, so he'd be upstairs in his bedroom in the morning and the sound of his wife cooking eggs in the frying pan was excruciating to him. So he dealt with this for 9 months. And couldn't find relief, went to psychiatrists, neurologists, audiologists, anybody he could find. Finally decided to have a risky brain surgery, a surgeon who decided it was probably a blood vessel moving up against the acoustic nerve. Operation appeared to be successful, but within hours after the operation, he suffered a massive stroke. His heart stopped twice, was revived. Essentially what happens to John and what this book is about is that he wakes up with a completely different personality and a compulsion to create art.
So he goes from being a chiropractor to seeing the world how? Seeing himself in the world how?
Well, this was a man who also had tremendous physical problems when he woke up. He was deaf in one ear, permanent double vision, permanent vertigo, permanent weakness on his left side. This is a man who had a young son who would never be able to, toss him up in the air or play ball with him or ride bikes with him. So his role as a father, all of a sudden, was radically changed. And he was very obsessive, and he was also extremely outgoing. All of a sudden, he would say anything that was on his mind, anything and everything, and often inappropriately. So he, for the first couple of years was trying to get his bearings, but one thing that kept happening over and over was that he felt this need to scribble on things. That's how it started out, with cartoon figures and scribbles, and he'd pick up anything, a magazine, the walls in the basement, a rock on the beach. He'd even scribble on his cane if he could, scratch things. So he realized that this was a very powerful need for him to express himself.
An artistic need.
Yes.
As we're talking, show two particular stills that we have of John's art. There it is, right there. So he wakes up out of this, and he has this incredible artistic ability that he did not have before the stroke, correct?
No, I mean, he liked art. He was a doodler.
But couldn't have done that.
No.
And so in many ways, and you have said this, that, interesting, the neuroscience behind the story is important. But you say that science may never really figure out the brain and our identity. May never really figure it out. Meaning, after all this research, after all this work, and you've also talked about your own fascination with the brain having to do with your own experience, because you were diagnosed with bipolar
That's right.
disorder. In many ways, while this is about John, it's about the brain and how little we know.
It is. Every day we're learning something new about the brain, and science is progressing in leaps and bounds. But there are always going to be limits. How do we know really the source of our everyday thoughts and emotions and our inclinations to do certain things? We can match them up with genes. We can match things up with influences from the environment. But one thing in writing this book and in researching and talking to John and his family, and also doing research on neuroscience in general, in its search to figure out what the brain is about and where the self is located, what are the basic ingredients of the self. what I realized is that you can take so much away from the brain. You can be damaged in so many ways, and people vastly more brain damage than John, obviously, and yet still have a self, still have an identity, still have a soul. So, I tell a story in there about a woman in her 30s who's been hospitalized, vegetative her entire life because she was born basically just with a brain stem. No development in her hemispheres. So she basically had the most elemental functions of life. She was insensate to pain, didn't respond to people, was probably blind and deaf. And they brought in a doctor just to have her evaluated one more time. For whatever reason, he brought in a music box, and he opened the music box. And for the first time in this woman's life, she turned towards something and she smiled. And for the rest of her life, it was just a couple of years, there was always music playing in her room. Now, this was a woman who didn't have an identity. For all intents and purposes, had no soul. She had a brainstem, but she responded to music. So we know that she wasn't deaf, at least, but she responded to music. To me, that's an example that the soul is there, and there can be very, very little left in your brain, and yet something about who you are will emerge.
I need to ask you this, just looking at you talking about this right now. This book moved you?
Yes,
How?
very much so. I think for precisely this reason. It's a cliche when you hear people say, the resilience of the human spirit or the resilience of the human mind. But time and again, knowing John over 8 years and watching how he progressed from someone who was obsessive and self-involved and just doing art and disconnected from his family to someone who gradually learned how to use his art to reconnect with the world. And then looking into cases like this woman, this vegetative woman, you realize that the human soul, the human spirit, the human mind is incredibly resilient.
This book did a lot for you, and it could do a lot for a lot of other people. It's a good read for all of us, isn't it?
I think so. I think there's a lot to be learned, that you can suffer tremendous deficits, that you can have damage, that you can have life-altering accidents, and things can happen to the most important instrument that we have, and that's our brain. And yet you can not only survive, but in cases like John, flourish.
Shadows bright as glass. Amy Ellis Nutt, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Steve.
One-on-one will be right back right after this. Thank you.
This special edition of One-on-One with Steve Adubato is brought to you from the Tisch WNET studios at Lincoln Center. Funding has been provided by Barnabas Health, County College of Morris, connecting learning and life, New Jersey Manufacturers Insurance Group, auto insurance, homeowners insurance, and banking under the principle of stewardship, and by MD Advantage Insurance Company of New Jersey. Promotional support provided by The Record, North Jersey's trusted source, and NorthJersey.com. Transportation provided by Airbrook Limousine, serving the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area. One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been produced in partnership with St. Joseph's Healthcare System.